You're listening to The Fan Marillion, an unofficial companion podcast for the Amazon Prime series The Rings of Power. I'm your host, Glorfindoll, reacting to the show each week and cosplaying as a babbling brook so that Tom Bombadil will want me. This time, we're covering The Rings of Power Episode 3, Adar. So if you haven't watched it yet, turn back now because there's going to be a metric cave troll ton of spoilers today. So what were the highlights on Tolkien's social media this week after the first 2 episodes aired? Let's hit some of the big ones that interested me. Many folks were disappointed in the little death by 1,000 cuts to the lore, as I call them. And by that I mean, we understand that without rights to the Silmarillion, you can't tell those stories exactly, unless they were retold in The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, or the appendices. We get it. But I think for many fans, this begs the question, wouldn't you go whole hog on the accuracy that you can capture? I think axing truths that they did have rights to is what frustrates some fans. And I don't mean arbitrary melanin characteristics or women having the audacity to leave their kitchens just because Tolkien didn't explicitly say they ever left their kitchens. So don't nod and think that I'm supporting whatever forced diversity woke agenda complaints you think I'm agreeing with. I'm referring to canon characters being discarded in favor of made-up ones, and the ones that are there, they slap differently. They may have incongruent motivations, backstories, and journeys that just don't look the same. You can chalk as much of this up to things like timeline condensing, character and scene condensing for screenplay writing, as you like. But at the end of the day, everyone would make their own choices, and it seems the freedom with which the showrunners veered right away into fanfiction territory is proving to be a stumbling block for the show's launch. It isn't bringing in the existing fan base without a lot of kicking and screaming. This was a topic I saw in every single thread of every single article I saw from general fandom news sites, YouTube recaps, fan pages, and fan forums where I lurk. So it's a common sentiment across the board. However, while I felt this pretty hard with the setup in episodes 1 and 2, with episode 3 I'm starting to breathe a little easier and thinking that the whole show won't function that way. Honestly, after episode 3, I'm seeing more and more canon content creep into the script, and I think by the end of the series, when we all meet up at the last alliance on the slopes of Mount Doom, us butthurt fans are going to be told to sit the fuck down. And I love it when it happens. I'm literally begging to be put in my place by some canon revival. Canon me harder, Daddy Bezos. Speaking of the Silmarillion, some of the think pieces going up this week really made me laugh. I saw one from Nerdist with the caption, Middle-earth's creation myth found in the Silmarillion sets the, get this, optimistic tone for the stories to come. Nerdist, did we read the same book? Silmarillion is so full of toil, death, and despair. People point to Maedhros as an uplifting part of the book. Like, what? When Beren and Luthien got a happy ending, I was genuinely shocked because it was so off-tone with the rest of the stories. And so many people die along the way for that happy ending. Beren dies too, he just gets brought back later. Fake out happy ending. None of this is happy, folks. That's why we like it. You don't have to lie for clicks, Nerdist. Just lean in. The Silmarillion is highbrow, tree-hugging goth poetry, which is why every high school keeps a few copies in their library. When I want to feel awful and nihilistic and sad, I read the Silmarillion. So it's no wonder, then, that the Rings of Power showrunners, who are apparently just Neil Gaiman, have adopted a few more hopeful storylines in the process of fleshing out the Second Age's gaps. They've gone a different storytelling direction than the Silmarillion, and that might be a good thing. I've also seen a lot of chatter on the stranger, specifically who he is. And I really don't understand the confusion on this one. Everybody and their uncle is doing some matrix tier gymnastics to deny what their eyes are telling them. I've read posts all over social media that posit the stranger is a blue wizard. Tom Bombadil, Sauron, Radagast the Brown, Saruman, a Valar in disguise. It's commendable that some fans watched the first 2 episodes and still want to make predictions based on the canon timeline. But do yourself a solid and toss it out with the Monday recycling and open your heart to the chaos of Rings of Power, Space, and Time. The stranger is a blue wizard? A nice thought, because the unfinished tales suggest they work in Middle-earth before the other wizards, who are sometimes called Istari. But we've already established what the showrunners have rights to, and that ain't it. And here's how to remember. There's a little Easter egg in The Hobbit: An Unexpected Journey, when Gandalf can't remember the names of the last 2 wizards. I've quite forgot their names, Ian McKellen says. That was a cute nod to the fact they legally couldn't discuss the 2 blue wizards. So this is quite definitely not a blue wizard of the Second Age. So what about the people suggesting Tom Bombadil? I would bet $100 no. Although I always appreciate Tom Bombadil enthusiasm, and I haven't lost hope for a cameo over the next 5 seasons. Speaking of Tom Bombadil, if you're looking for quality entertainment, may I recommend the Fellowship of the Ring audiobook read by Richard Engels. Put that shit on 1.5 speed and listen to his absolutely eldritch vibrato as he sings all the songs in Tom Bombadil's voice. Anyway, Tom Bombadil is part of Middle-earth and has been here since its beginning. That would predate the Elves' Crossing and any other activity of this show. It'd be a stretch and incongruent with everything we know about his mannerisms and source. I also saw comments suggesting the stranger is Sauron coming to Middle-earth. Except Sauron has been here for as long as Morgoth was here, which was the entirety of the First Age. And we saw Sauron in his fancy helmet gathering creepy critter forces in Episode 1. So why and from where would he be arriving just now in Middle-earth via asteroid? He's been here. That's why there's super organized orc tunnels down in the Southlands. So anyway, if sites and fans who know better could stop with the, but it's too early for Gandalf, it must be these other 10 things, and simply accept the 1,500 ham-fisted audiovisual cues that the showrunners have painted in crayon on the fridge door for us, that'd be great. It's Gandalf. Don't overthink it. A slew of other things happened this week in Rings of Power world. As they've been threatening to do for 2 years now, trolls, who are upset enough to make fantasy books the linchpin to their own ethnic heritage and self-confidence, descended upon Amazon Prime, Rotten Tomatoes, and any other media review site to say, boo, 1 star for forced diversity. Same old, fantasy fans are used to this. Amazon had enough sense to shut down their reviews until they can have humans sort through it. The worst thing about Rings of Power trolls, specifically, is that they put me in the undesirable position of defending a $1 trillion company that notoriously evades taxes and busts its unions. So, thanks for that this week. The cast put out a unified statement against the race-based trolling, and then Amazon Prime retweeted it and stood behind the statement, which was nice to see. Likewise, most of the big Hobbit actors from the Lord of the Rings trilogy also posed in All Are Welcome Elvish t-shirts. And when you check out these posts on all the socials, you'll see this trend. We're not racist. I haven't seen any racism. We're just upset that forced diversity narratives were valued over authenticity. We're being persecuted for being loyal to the books. Oh, how to even begin unpacking that cowardice. Oh boy. Look, I like lore as much as the next nerd, but if you love the lore truly, then it's not possible for you to so easily disregard the premise of varied skin color. Middle-earth has an icy north and a hot south, just like my hemisphere. And my planet evolved skin colors to match its varied climates. Why wouldn't Middle-earth too, under similar conditions? Also, who cares? It's such a silly thing to dictate an entire smear campaign, to dedicate your weeks and weeks to draw a line in the sand over when you otherwise supposedly love the IP. It's so petty that it couldn't possibly be in good faith. Nobody's skin color is ruining any canon experiences. And if they are, you're the one telling on yourself. And I saw comments like, oh, but there's plenty of people of color in Harad. They could have worked with that instead. Yeah, no one cares about Harad. It's not central to any canon stories that fans know and love. And how convenient that is for you. Also, Harad aligns with Sauron, so I guess you're asking for people of color to only portray the villains? What an odd iceberg to sink on. Harad. And if you're upset about Rings of Power for non-racial reasons, then congratulations. The posts about the cast's very real experiences being flamed to shit are not about you. And you can stop mucking up the comment sections for these issues with your false flags and bad faith interjections and trying to center yourself while nailing yourself on a cross. Not all criticism is racism. Right. But these posts are about racism. So be quiet. I should know better than to ask Tolkien fans to be quiet, though. That's the pot calling the kettle black if I've ever heard any. So, what a full launch week. So much happened, so much reaction, so much pushback. Let's hope for the showrunners and the cast that it's smooth sailing through the rest of fall. And for our Southern Hemisphere friends, spring. Now let's talk about what we saw this week for episode 3, the ominously titled Adar. I rate this episode 2 glasses of wine, meaning I did have to refill in order to finish. A rating of 2 glasses of wine is worse than just 1 glass, which was episode 2's rating last week. But I have to compliment that the showrunners only covered 3 locations this week and gave those 3 some presence, rather than forcing all of our characters' locations into a single hour and only popping into each. Unfortunately, that strength was also a weakness, because too much of this episode we spent scuttling around with Harfoot migration plans and Gandalf's bumbling, "Oh!" rather than where I wanted to be, which was with the Númenóreans and the Orcs' camp. I like the Harfoots and what the showrunners have done with them, and I don't mind keeping up with the Harfoots from time to time. But we're setting a wasteful precedent here with precious episode minutes. That Harfoot content could have been cut in half or more, and that time given to Númenor, which all felt rushed and minimalist. So let's go in order. First up this episode, the Southlands. Holy shit, the orcs didn't just capture Arondir, they captured his watchtower company and a whole lot of Southlanders for slave labor, building more tunnels. They didn't have enough tunnels. We need more tunnels. They have the most wonderful practical effects and prosthetics on these orcs, who look incredible. which is all the more confusing in contrast with the absolutely atrocious CGI Chihuahua warg. Peter Jackson's wargs 20 years ago looked better than that, and they never looked great. But holy crap, someone's getting fired on Monday. It's Chuck. Chuck didn't finish the warg, and nobody caught it in the pre-screenings. So, the orcs are well organized by a commander who they call Adar. Adar is Elvish for father. The use of this word shocks our elf friends and is the first cue to the audience that this commander might not be Sauron, but someone else. After all, why would Sauron use an Elvish name amongst orcs instead of the black speech of Morgoth's realms? So let's make a fun prediction on this podcast and go along with what the showrunners are telling us. Let's say Adar is going to be just an elf. Joseph Mall's official character descriptions support that. In addition, I also think it's too early to meet Sauron face to face. The showrunners are saving some chips for the season finale, or maybe even next season. And we know from his future deeds in The Lord of the Rings that Sauron doesn't like to get his hands dirty. He makes sweet promises and corrupts many into becoming his servants to do his bidding. So do I think Sauron would be overseeing this one tunnel build in a prison camp? No, I don't. I think it's perfectly plausible that Sauron corrupted this elf, who I suspect will be called a dark elf, to oversee this project. After all, the show is called Rings of Power. Sauron has other projects he's working on right now that wouldn't keep him in a tunnel camp. There's an infamous dark elf from the first age in the Silmarillion, which they wouldn't have rights to, but it's possible that this Adar is very loosely fashioned after him, or inspired by parts of his character. What's that history? I thought you'd never ask. Well, it's all very tragic, as are most Silmarillion tales, as I've said. His name was Eol. Doriath was a forest kingdom in Beleriand, which was destroyed before the events of this show. It was very large and very mighty in its heyday. But Eol longed to found his own moody kingdom away from everyone else, which I definitely get. So Eol loved the twilight under the stars and hated the sun and the Doriath elves, who he blamed for the rise of evil in the land. So this misanthrope fucked off and went into the uninhabited forest and founded Nan Elmoth. While there, he also learned smithing with his neighbors, the dwarves of the Blue Mountains, and made some spectacular swords that get famous later through the deeds of others. Surprisingly, it was these acts that earned Eol the title Dark Elf, and not his abduction and rapes of Turgon's sister. Nomenclature is funny like that. But I guess the Doriath elves recognized the budding school shooter inside of Eol early enough to call a spade, so... If Adar is going to be anything like our Silmarillion Dark Elf, it's a safe bet he'll be a total asshole. And Joseph Mall definitely has the face for it. Arondir and the orcs served us the best fighting yet on the show. And boy, it did not disappoint. It had the agility and shock value of a classic Peter Jackson Legolas maneuver, but without the silliness. I'm sure some wire work was involved, but in my head I was like, shit, is he a gymnast? Is this a body double? It looked great. If you were hoping for the odd elvish one-on-one fight choreography we all know and love from the Jackson era, here it is, brought forward and perfected. Also, the orcs aren't just making tunnels, they're also going through a lot of First Age war artifacts, looking for something. Could it be the spooky dark magic artifact that Theo is carrying across Mordor as we speak? But that's literally all I'm going to say about it because, as we've said, I don't care about Theo. They can find him for all I care. The second thing we do this episode is make it to Numenor. There's so many new names and faces with this location. So far, the show's been very careful not to throw too many new places and characters at you per episode. So I understand why they saved Numenor for episode 3. If you want a summary or photo reminder, Amazon Prime has a nice location-based and spoiler-free character widget in the same place you go to launch an episode. It's on a tab called Explore. Numenor is so beautiful. This must have dipped into the Warg budget. The cliffside housing, the lights, the ship designs, the stonework. Those mighty statues of humans coming out of the mountains like they were etched into them. Does that art style feel familiar? It should to many of you. Fans of The Lord of the Rings may remember ornate stonework ruins littered throughout Middle-earth, explained as the work of ancient men. One such formation was Weathertop. More examples are the 2 massively tall guards with their hands outstretched at the end of Fellowship. You saw our Fellowship floating in boats past the statue's sandals. All of these are ways in which Peter Jackson showed us the rich history of humans in the south of Middle-earth. Eventually, and for reasons I won't spoil, there's a diaspora of Numenorians across southern Middle-earth, which is how the line of kings makes its way to the places we know and love from the Jackson movies, like Gondor. And speaking of Gondor, did you eyeball that familiar white tree in the gardens of Numenor's palace? It should look familiar because that's the original white tree of the kings. Now how about our Southland fish out of water Halbrand? He's got a Flynn Rider persona, the suave but sassy street rat. I can't stand it. We learned some things about him this week, so let's recap on that. We learned that Halbrand is in fact a Southlander who comes from a long line of local leaders. There was chatter that he could be a refugee or exile from Numenor, and I suspected that too, but that prediction didn't pan out this week, as we see that he has zero knowledge of Numenor. We learned that he's the tropey, street-smart pocket thief character that apparently every fantasy show needs. And, as is typical, we also learned that Halbrand is an excellent and deadly fighter. Speaking of tropes, I was a bit bummed to see how cookie-cutter some of those Numenor scenes were. Above and beyond Halbrand's tired characterization. Like, we got the buy a round of drinks on me trope, the sleight of hand theft trope, and the street puppet show for commoners, which is always a free space on the fantasy show bingo card. By the way, Halbrand was just lost at sea. How does he have so much money? Should we assume he lifted someone's purse? And we meet Elendil and his family. We got a few peeks into what's going on at the core of this legendary city. To recap, this city has a long relationship with the elves. But while elves of that era are still alive today and remember those events clearly, the Numenorians are many, many generations down the road and have no direct knowledge to draw on. So, of course, distance is a relationship killer, and this seems to be the case as Numenor ages. Elves, once parental figures and close friends, are now persona non grata in this proud island kingdom. But why? It's not really said, so we'll have to wait and see. There are those in Numenor who still maintain the history, still speak the ancient Quenya tongue of the Noldorine elves, and teach it to their kids. These people yearn to reunite with elves. The Queen Regent sets this up nicely by telling the audience the history of Elendil's name as Elf-Friend. So this gives Galadriel an ally in the city, and one who's far less smarmy and untrustworthy than Halbrand, in my opinion. Girl, cut Halbrand loose and join up with Elendil. I am begging you. Now, what about the hunt for Sauron and the mystery of Sauron's emblem? If you recall, Galadriel saw it seared into her brother Finrod's flesh, and the elves didn't know what it meant. It said that it's Sauron's calling card, but it's not a language the elves are familiar with. It might not be any language at all. In fact, online chatter this week suggested it could be a few things. The future eye shape was one such idea I saw. Another one was that it was the shape of his crown, also a good one, but I felt that was too obvious and probably a red herring. The correlation of this symbol to Sauron's activities in the Southlands did not go unnoticed, and I saw that many shared my prediction that it was a map of Mordor's signature mountain ranges, with a line right down the middle like an X marks the spot. This would explain why he left it etched on his abandoned fortress up north. Galadriel said it herself in episode 1. He's telling stragglers where to meet up. She just couldn't decipher it at the time. Well, this week's Rings of Power episode revealed the answer in Numenor's Great Library. It is indeed a visual representation of Mordor's mountains, a map. The librarian conveys this by sharing some contraband from an escaped prisoner of Morgoth's work camps from the First Age. The establishment of Mordor was a backup plan Sauron had prepared. I thought this was a brilliant and engaging way to tie in some lore from the Silmarillion about Morgoth's bad deeds without expressly visiting those off-limit events. But unfortunately, it seems like Galadriel, with all her awkward close-ups on a horse this week, have decided taking on the Mordor orcs with Halbrand is being directed by a higher power. So we're buckling in for this dynamic duo to head back across the sea and take on the forces that Adar is building. Maybe they'll meet up with Arondir. Which brings me to some more predictions. Now that we're sure Halbrand is indeed an OG Southlander, I'm afraid I have some bad news for Arondir and Bronwyn. I'm guessing, since the showrunners went out of their way to tell us Theo's father left him and Bronwyn, I'm going to predict that Halbrand is that runner. Arondir is about to have a rude awakening when Theo's dad comes back into the picture here in a few episodes. And I have a much darker prediction for Halbrand in the distant future, now that we know he's descended from a line of kings, even if just lowly Southlandy ones. But I'll save that for later this season, because I'd like to be able to guess all 9 at once rather than piecemeal them. Wink. And at last, I have to at least mention what's going on with the Harfoots. Again, I love this part of the storyline so far, but it's abusing its privileges at the expense of other locations, so I'm starting to get upset. We got Gandalf his star charts, but then he lit them on fire by accident like a doofus who's only been in corporeal form for 48 hours and doesn't know how to use his hands yet. I guess I'll give him a break. So we're back at square one on finding his destination. Which, honestly, I don't have a guess for that yet. I genuinely have no idea where Gandalf's going, and I like it. The caravan is leaving, and we get a taste of what happens to Harfoots who don't stay with their caravan. They just never see their friends and family again, even though it's also said that they take the same migratory circuits each cycle. So it shouldn't matter if you get slowed down, you know where you're going anyway. That part didn't really work for me. Unless they were trying to say that wild animals kill you if you lag behind too long. Whatever, you gotta stay with the caravan, and it ain't waiting. Big yikes. Nori got in trouble for helping Gandalf and her family, as injured as her father is, and was banished to the back of the caravan, which is apparently a death sentence during migration. So in the glimmer of hope and happiness we get for this episode, Gandalf offers to make up for his inconvenience by pushing the family cart. This is accepted by the desperate Brandyfoot family, and Gandalf is now part of the gang. And all of that took like half an hour. Yes, I'm not exaggerating. Christ. We'll talk about where things go in Middle-earth from here on the next episode of the Fan Marillion. Let's start closing this down with the trivia question. In Numenor this episode, we met 3 members of Elendil's house. Elendil himself, Isildur his son, and Iarion his daughter. There is a 3rd child who goes on to make lasting changes in Middle-earth, much like the rest of this famous family. Can you name this other son? And here's a hint. They said his name once in this episode. The other son is Anarion. And now for our vocab word. On this week's episode, we met the inhabitants of the island of Numenor. For Lord of the Rings fans, this is a very important island, and you met 2 key ancestors of Aragorn who live there, Elendil and his son Isildur. These peoples of Numenor are also referred to later in the timeline as the Dunedain, and you might remember Aragorn being called, quote-unquote, one of the Dunedain. So, the vocab word this week is Dunedain. It's an Elvish Sindarin word literally meaning Western men. This is in reference to the fact that Numenorians lived on that little island west of Middle-earth, and as they dispersed later, they needed to be differentiated from typical Middle-earth humans who live for far less time and are generally less refined, and certainly no friends of elves. And, launching next week, join us on Twitch every Thursday before the episode to do themed Tolkien trivia at 9 o'clock Eastern Time. To put it on your calendar and see instructions for joining, find the event on our Facebook page, The Fan Marillion. Next week's trivia theme will be the Fellowship of the Ring, where questions will center around all things Fellowship, including the novel, the Peter Jackson movie, and maybe the Ralph Bakshi movie too if I'm feeling frisky. You'll have to tune in to find out. There is no fee to join. It'll be totally free, and I'll be hosting. I'm Glorfindoll, and this was my show. I welcome your opinion, but remember, I'm not the fandom, just a fan. Join the conversation at Fan Marillion on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Or, for flaming that's too spicy for socials, send me an email at fanmarillion@gmail.com. Please subscribe, rate, and review this podcast wherever you get your podcasts.
This has been an Opus Nox Media production. Produced and edited by Ali Bachman. For more information on Opus Nox Media, please visit opusnoxmedia.com.